Hello, everyone. Happy Sunday. I am here with one of my greatest and dearest friends, Regina. Now, Regina is a real piece of work. She's a sun. Am I allowed to talk about your chart, Regina?
Go for it.
Okay.
Yes,
These
absolutely.
are the astrologers. She's a Sun-Mars conjunction in Capricorn. You do the math, okay? If you're scared of her, then you're right to be scared. No, I'm just kidding. But she is fierce and she is a warrior spirit, and she has a Cancer moon, so she's also really a softie, and an Aquarius rising. So she's also a theoretical animal. She's an astro twin to Jim Carrey, the comedian. So we might get a few jokes in this episode. How's your day going, Regina?
Going really well. Been looking forward to this time with you.
Nice. How's your new dog?
Awesome. Merlin. I love Merlin.
Oh my
Merlin
God.
the magician.
Sorry.
Merlin the magician.
Oh
My
my God.
dog. Yeah.
You have a dog named Merlin, and I have a cat named Merlin.
I know, that's crazy. Totally independent, completely siloed from each other. We did
Yeah.
this.
Do you think that's like some synchronicity message that we're supposed to be friends?
I mean, I think synchronicity is always a message. So yes, it's a message that's like we were destined to come together at
Yeah.
the
How did we become friends?
we started working together as interpreters. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and we
Yeah.
were sign language interpreters, and I just remember thinking, man, she's real in
Intense.
control. Like I work with a lot of teammates. I mean, I've been an interpreter, sign language interpreter for 24 years. How long have you been an interpreter?
33 years.
Oh my
30.
God.
Well, it depends on where you count from. I think I've been certified that long. I've been certified. I've been certified for 31 years, but I was practicing for about 3 years before that.
So are you friends with all your teams or?
No, no. Most of my teams, we are, well, it's interesting, right? Because we're in this virtual space now. So prior to the virtual space, so prior to COVID, I did all my jobs in person. And so you kind of became, tight with certain people that you worked with, regularly. But now that we've been in the virtual space, we're ships in the night. Like I see that person on screen for a limited period of time. We might wish each other well and then might never see each other again.
Yeah.
So, but with you, we had a rock'em sock'em robot moment. We had an intense sort of I don't know if it was miscommunication or just I don't know. How would you characterize it?
Oh, I was like, I basically was like, chill, bro. And like, you were like, who are you? But you never heard my voice. Like, you didn't really know
Right.
me. 'Cause as interpreters, we don't speak. We're just like robots, basically, you know? So
Yeah.
knowing me now, you probably have been like, oh, whatever. But we have a great composite chart for the astrologers. So when I looked at the composite chart between me and Regina, I was like, oh my God, I'm not wasting this thing. I'm going to make a friendship out of this. So that's how that.
Yeah, and me coming from totally not knowing anything really about astrology, I remember having that like eh, with you, and then somehow we end up on the phone together. I don't know if you were like, just call me, this text thing isn't working, or whatever. We ended up on the phone together, and one of the first things you said was, listen, if you could look at our charts, you would see we have this great composite chart, and if you will just forgive me, I know we're going to be really good friends. And I was like, wow. Okay. She obviously knows something I don't know
Yeah.
about this relationship.
We worked hard for our friendship. We don't always see eye to eye.
It's true. But I think we're gaining more and more tolerance and appreciation even of not meeting eye to eye,
Yeah.
perhaps.
We're
You know,
both kind of dominant. I mean, like I just feel like we're both a little alpha,
hmm
which I enjoy in a friendship, honestly.
we're both strong warrior people,
Yeah,
you
I'm a
know.
Sun square Mars and you're a Sun Mars conjunction.
But I will tell you that I have always done much better with people who are forthright and like out there than people who I can't deal I don't deal very well with passive aggressive type of people. So if there's someone that's like people pleasing but your vibe is like this doesn't match up, that makes me a little bit crazy. So I'd really rather have the person who sort of is right out there and occasionally steps on my toes from my perspective, you know? I'd
Yeah.
rather have that and be like, hey, you stepped on my toe, and have you go like, well, you put it out there, you know, and be like, okay, that's true, you know, than to have you be like, oh, make nice. Oh, sorry, I offended you. But
Yeah.
inside you're like, bitch, you know?
Well, so okay, so we're here today, and I totally agree with you. When people's vibes get weird, I'd rather be like, just tell me what's wrong. Like your vibe
Right.
is killing me, basically. But yeah, you and I always have good vibes. Like I don't think we've ever like given each other weird frequencies. We always just have weird verbal exchanges. But
Yeah, that's true. But we're coherent.
and then there was the 7-Up incident when we got to fight about 7
The
Up.
7F incident, which will live on in infamy.
Dude, what if I was drinking a Diet 7-Up on this episode? Which
I know, wouldn't that be funny? Like,
I'm drinking a coffee.
I'm drinking a sparkling mineral water sans aspartame, so I can live up to my criticisms.
You're so clean and perfect.
Eh,
Okay, so
not,
we're
not even,
actually here for a really important reason today,
yeah.
which is that a lot of okay, so in astrology, and I think you're kind of getting this story, but there's a lot of astrologers trying to translate ancient Greek texts, and this is a big part of scholarship. There's a whole subset of astrologers called Hellenistic astrologers, and there's a lot of translation of ancient Greek texts in that field. Um, and there's a lot of historical experts on the translations, and I'm not a historian. I'm actually a linguistic expert. And I see you as another linguistic expert. So we're here to kind of teach the crew, the Moira Press students and astrologers at large about how we work as translators. So, you know, when we're looking at the Vedias Valens Anthology Moira Press edition, I want them to understand how, you know, I thought as a translator, but this is how I've learned from sign language interpreters to think. So I basically used everything I knew as a sign language interpreter in order to translate these books. Now, the first question I have for you is, what does it even mean to be a certified sign language interpreter?
Oh my gosh, so many things are popping into my head right now just listening to you talk. What does it mean to be certified? It means basically it just means that there is a governing body who is self-selected to provide licensure. It's made up of the membership, or at least a select portion of the membership, though anyone may run. You can probably feel some of the vibes behind how I feel about the organization as a whole. I feel like they've gotten a little bit too big for their britches, but basically it's a governing body who provides a test, an evaluation mechanism by which to, you know, matriculate where you are and whether you're ready, whether you're plug and play or you're, you know, entry level. I guess that's what they say. They claim to be measuring entry level or above, which may or may not be helpful.
Well, this is really interesting. It's making me realize that that the translators of the Vedas Valens Anthology and other ancient books aren't necessarily certified. So you can be a historian and you can know ancient Greek, but that doesn't mean you're a certified interpreter, right?
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, the certified interpreters began somewhere in the 70s, I guess 74, when RID first established itself. But there have been interpreters around interpreting ASL to English and vice versa for long before that. And they were typically, you know, members of the community. Either they had deaf parents or for some reason they were connected to the community in some way, right? So, and they were doing, you know, they were doing the job that they were doing, and in many ways, perhaps better, right? But there were certain areas, maybe on the ethical end, it didn't feel as consistent or rule governed, or maybe as safe or as confidential, I guess I should say, to the deaf community, which is what, you know, spurred the advent of the licensing, right? But you don't have to be, the truth is you don't have to be certified to be an interpreter. I can hang my shingle out anytime I want to. And if if the deaf community accepts me, if my clients say, we like it like that, come back again, then I'm going to have some work. But there are now more and more often, there are state regulations that say, to be practicing in this field, you have to at least have a state exam, if not a national certification. So
Interesting. So if these other translators of these Greek astrological texts aren't certified, we could still respect their work for the hard work they put in and just for what it is. We don't have to say like, oh, you weren't a certified interpreter or translator, but we can say like, oh, what I like about this translation is X, Y, and Z, and wow, that was amazing they could do that without being a certified interpreter.
right, translator, right?
What do you think about the code of ethics? We should talk a little bit about what are the main codes of ethics that we use. Because I want you to know I applied all these to the written translation, everything I've learned as an interpreter.
That's fascinating, actually. So I think the biggest one, the first one that always comes to mind, has to do with confidentiality. I think that's the biggest fear of someone, a deaf person using, or someone using an interpreter is, are they going to respect my privacy? Are they going to keep this information private, confidential? But then outside of that, then their very next concern is, or should be, are they rendering the message faithfully? Right. So what does it mean to render the message faithfully? That's the big question, right? It's like, what's being, so a translation in my mind, there are things that you have to determine for yourself when you're taking in the source text, what things are to remain and what things are to be left out without leaving out the content, right? Because there's certain things that end up being, I think, artifacts in a translation where you have to ask yourself, and certainly the work that we do is special because it's happening in real time. And because it's visual to auditory, we can render it almost in real time rather than waiting until someone's finished talking and then rendering a text. We're rendering it in real time. So we're making, minute, immediate decisions about what the source text is going to be. And I have to decide, what am I going to leave in and what am I going to leave out without altering the message? Because at some point, including, we used to think, you have to include every single thing, like almost like word for word, even though we know it doesn't work that way in a visual to an auditory language. It's not really word for word, it's concepts, right? But we used to think we had to include every minute little detail. And then we took a step back and said, actually, by doing that, we're actually skewing the message because there's so much, it's like a dump, it's like an information dump, rather than what I believe we should be doing, which is more like collating the information into a package that is readable, right? That is digestible, which means, these other little extra details that really don't alter the message one way or the other become artifacts and they get in the way.
Fascinating. We would call that an intrusion, actually a linguistic intrusion.
There you
go. So hey, want to hear something crazy, Regina?
Hmm.
Okay, so confidentiality. Check this out. So look at the book cover. Can you tell what
Yes.
the book is?
No.
Isn't that weird? Why would I, as a business person, not put the title of a book?
No title. Yeah.
No author. You don't even know who the author of this book is. That's weird. You know why?
Maybe to make it mysterious.
Okay, these are really mysterious books. They're mysterious, occult, ancient hermetic texts. Okay.
And what is the symbol? Is it the
It's a
fluid?
one. It's a one.
That's the one in red, but what is the design? What is that design?
Oh, this I just got at Michael's Crafts and I liked the colors and
Oh, okay.
yeah. And I sewed all this stuff together to make this cool looking design. But okay, get this. Okay, this is the Vettius Valens anthology, written 2,000 years ago by a guy named Vettius Valens. Well, in book 6, he writes this oath. Here, I want to show you the first edition. This is book 1, edition 2. Look at book 1, edition 1. It says Vedic Fountains of Antioch, Anthology Book 1. Okay. And here's a picture of me. Check this out.
Looking hot with your typewriter.
Is that why you're my friend? Because I'm hot. No, I'm just kidding.
That's true. That's the only reason. It's the only reason.
I,
No, that couldn't be true.
I do think you're hot. I'm not, I know I'm not supposed to say that on TV, but I do. Okay. We have a good composite. Well, I love you. Okay.
Right?
Yeah, I do love you. Okay. So anyway, the thing is, I translated book 1, and then when I got to book 6, he releases this oath where he pretty much says, may these texts only be released to the initiated and not to the uninitiated. And then he goes on to release the length of life calculation where he says that how long you're going to live according to your chart. So, as a faithful, ethical translator, I had to then make the text unavailable to the uninitiated. You can't get these from me unless you're initiated into astrology already.
Is that right?
Isn't that crazy?
Wow. That is crazy.
That was,
So that's so interesting too, that you don't get it until the end instead of in the beginning.
yeah, you get, no, get,
FYI, don't release these. So did you release any of them before you got to that point?
yeah, that's why the first edition you can see because I had only read book 1, I hadn't read book 6. And when I got to book 6, then I went back and covered them all up. Isn't that epic?
That is epic.
Yeah, and that was because of the
Yeah.
code of ethics, because I realized you have to protect the confidentiality of the client. And my client here was Vedic Valens.
So interesting that that was the first tenet that I mentioned, right? Confidentiality, because I think it's the one we all think about.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but I think it's probably the most serious, the most egregious violation of, if you violate any tenet, that would be the one that's most egregious, I think, because we are the proverbial flies on the wall. Whether you're doing a written translation or you're in someone's home interpreting a medical appointment, right? Or a funeral or whatever. Like you wouldn't be there unless you were the translator, because you don't probably even know these people. They wouldn't have invited you into their home except for the fact that you're the translator. So, when somebody does a one-on-one appointment with their, mental health counselor, it's never one-on-one. It's one-on-two because the translator's there, right? So you impact the situation. Early on, this is a really interesting point too. Early on, when we were first, organizing as a professional body, just like the thought was, oh, we have to get every little thing, right? The thought was, okay, well, oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. I'll come back to it. We were talking about confidentiality, and then I segued into something, and then I lost my train of thought.
Okay.
Uh,
Well, I just want to say,
yes, because we used to like to say, we're just invisible, right? One was, translating is you got to get everything in, right? Second is, we're invisible. So we should strive to be invisible. And I think we matured a lot when we finally realized or admitted there's no way we're invisible, because it's one-on-two, it's not one-on-one. So now that I've admitted that I'm there, now I can recognize the impact that I have on the situation. Now I can take steps to mitigate that impact once I admit that I'm actually making it. So you're making an impact just by doing the translation.
fascinating. Well, that's like the different models, right? There was the machine model, and then there's the helper model where we're helping deaf people, and then that was like seen as really bad. And then we turned it into the machine model where like, we are just a machine, we are a conduit, and that was a model. And what's the model where they accept that the interpreter has an influence?
Ally.
Oh, the ally model. So
Yeah.
I'm an ally to Vedic Fallon's, actually, even because I feel like in some ways the other translators have just disrespected his confidentiality because he's dead. They're like, he lived 2,000 years ago, so we can just do whatever we want with his open source content or whatever. But like the ally model is like, I'm an ally to Vedic Fallon's. Like, no, I don't know.
And there's the bilingual bicultural model too.
Okay.
Right. And the bilingual bicultural model is like, we're not just working for the deaf person. Let's remember that, right? So we're not just working on behalf of Valens, right? We're working with an eye on the fact that there's a consumer that's going to be reading this, right?
Oh yeah, we're like an ally to the hearing person and an ally to the deaf person. We're not just an ally to the. So I guess the ally model here would say that in order to be an ally to the readers of Valens, we have to release Valens. Like so, but if we're going to be an ally to Valens, then we release the. I think I found a nice middle ground by like releasing the books, but kind of making them only available if you already know about Valens,
Right,
basically.
right. Well, I mean, I think that's keeping true to what the intent was, right? Which is part of what the interpreting or translating is all about. That's probably one of the most important things,
Yeah.
is staying true to the intent of the message. So rendering the message faithfully, right?
I love that because the intent of Valens was to protect the books from people who weren't ready for the length of life calculations. So it's like if you're not old enough and stable enough to deal with the fact that we might tell you you're going to die at this age, like don't read these books. Like so I think yeah, I call this being like a humble servant to the text. Like I was a servant to the text. I wasn't like I'm going to put my will all over these texts. I'm like, what does the text want from me as the translator is kind of how I was looking at it, you know?
Right. Yeah, and I think that definitely that applies across the board for interpreting too.
Okay, so wait, I lost my wait, can you see me still?
I can.
Okay, let me ask you this question. Do you enjoy being an interpreter?
Well, I've done it for a long time. And I think, yes, I think a certain part of me is kind of wedded to the role. I think it suits me well for a number of reasons. And it has been good to me. It's been good to me as a field, as a profession. Um, just, learning the language itself was like, I'm sure you remember this too. Like it was just, I learned to sign in the deaf community, and it just was like a huge world, like through the looking glass. Like you have to know, right? You have to know
Mhm.
how special this language is. All languages are amazing, right? I'm a linguist too. My degree is in linguistics. And I'm fascinated by language and the underlying structures of language. But there's something really, really special about a language that is visual based and not auditory based.
Yeah.
I think so.
Well, isn't it interesting how every language has its strengths and that it does? Like if you're trying to describe a car accident in English, you're like, well, my car was over here on the left, and
Right.
then so-and-so's car was over here, and then you're like, well, I just had to be there. But in sign language, you can actually set it up in visual space. Like my car was here. The
Yeah.
other car was here. So I
Right.
was driving like this, and it went like this. You can actually show it in
Right.
sign language, right? Well,
Right.
Greek actually has things it can do too that English can't do. Like, for example, it can say it can do a third person command, like it can be like let there be light. Well, we can do that in English too, but like or it does a top down holistic so a lot of Greek thought was used on this top down societal level, and that's because of how the language is constructed.
Subjunctives or
Ah,
subjunctive, like what Spanish has, where it's like the vase broke itself. I
interesting.
think or is that the reflexive? Anyway, it's something that we don't have in English, but in Spanish they do.
And that
It's
changes how people are culturally. Like language and culture develop. So if the vase can break itself, then that whole culture is like, what? The vase broke itself. Like, it's
right.
like
Woo, it's not on me.
exactly. And in Greek language, and then also learning the concepts that don't exist. Like, one of the things that comes up in our translation is the Greek flavors. Like they'd be like, Mars is a flavor of pikros, which is sharp, piercing, biting, and it's like food that bites you back or whatever.
Oh,
Well,
interesting.
we don't have that flavor, you know? And so I think learning another language, you learn concepts that you've never heard
Yeah,
before.
for
You know?
sure, for sure. Cultural. You can't separate language from culture. Culture informs language, for sure.
Well, that's like they say, like with the Eskimo, the Inuits, they have like 100 words for snow because they see 100 kinds of snow. Whereas we wouldn't develop 100 words for snow because we don't see that much snow.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not contextually relevant.
Totally. It's so
Yeah.
interesting. That's so cool. I didn't know you had a linguistics degree.
Yeah, it's my undergraduate. It's an undergraduate degree.
Oh, wow.
But I was very fortunate because when I went to college, I was a non-traditional student. I was about 32 years old. And the linguistics program at the University of Colorado, where I was, it's like people don't come out of high school going, I want to be a linguist. You know, they might come out of college now being like, I want to help write languages for the Star Trek episodes or whatever, right? And they'd get into it that way, or like game theory kind of stuff, that kind of stuff. But for the most part, nobody graduates and thinks I'm going to get a degree in linguistics. So their major program was an MA program, but then they had a BA program also. So everything was slash courses. So I took all my courses with graduate students, which made, I felt it brought the level of instruction up. And then just what was expected in terms of assignments was heftier for the master students than it was for the undergrads. So I felt like I got a really good education in linguistics.
Huh. Well, I want you to know that non-trads are rad. No, I don't know. My friends, we used to be obsessed with non-traditional students. I always called them non-trads because they're
Non-trad,
like, you're a non-trad. Okay. Um,
non
so my
um,
next question for you is every text, or in our case, deaf people, equally easy or hard to translate? Why or why not?
no, no. And in fact, it's really interesting, I think, to think about the difference between translation and interpretation. Because the translation, the written translation, you're working with a fixed text. And with something that's live that you're interpreting, it's a kind of a moving target, and it's being created in the moment between the speakers, right? So you can't just like take a snapshot of it and then look at it analytically. You have to, there's a certain amount of it that is, you know, sort of gut spontaneously driven. And there will be times that you'll look back and say, I wish I would have done that differently. But you probably do that too with your translation. Even you know, it's nothing is ever perfect, right? So what was the question? I went
Is
far afield.
is every deaf person equally easy or hard to
Oh,
translate? And
well,
what
is
makes
every
them hard?
deaf person or is every sign language shop? Okay, okay. No, 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 no. Because all speakers are different, you know? And I could say the same thing about the hearing consumers. There are certain hearing consumers. One of the best people one of the most famous people that I ever interpreted for, and one of the best orators was Hillary Clinton. She came to the University of Colorado when I was a student there in 92 when Bill was elected, and she was doing a healthcare tour, and I got selected to interpret for her. And she was awesome to interpret for, because if she said, our topic today is X, and I'm going to look at it from 3 different perspectives. She never just, you know how often people do that and then they only do 2? So you've got it all set up in space, and then this one's just dangling there. It never really happens. No, she set everything up. Very organized speaker, did exactly what she said she was going to do, never wandered, always came back, everything tied together, nice little bow. It was enjoyable, really enjoyable. And then there have been other things that have been really enjoyable too, you know, but much harder. So I've interpreted for Angela Davis, talking about prison reform. That was, you know, some of those concepts were really dense and really challenging, but also really awesome. Like she's a great orator. Deaf people, it's another deal on that end, because deaf people have a wide variety of language education for political reasons, for cultural political reasons. A lot of deaf people, because the majority of them do not have deaf families, so they don't have the benefit of a visual language as a first language. A lot of them are language delayed or language deprived. and they learn ASL after their critical period, which is, boy, I'm really reaching back to remember that, but I think it's like 7 years old to 11, something like that. There's a window where your brain is most pliable for acquiring a first language. Once you have a first language, you can acquire any other language, but you have to have that first language in that critical period. So a lot of deaf people have non-standard ways of signing. That makes it hard to read. And the flip side is true. There are deaf people who their first language is ASL, and they're like so fast and furious. To me, as a hearing person, my eyes aren't as attuned to to a visual language as a deaf person's is. And so to me, sometimes it looks like a car speeding by. It's hard to sometimes pick out temporal markers. So you can mark, did this happen? What they're talking about yesterday? Is it about to happen? Is it happening right now? Did it happen to them or did it happen to somebody else? Those kinds of markers are much more subtle, I think, from my perspective, in ASL than they are in English. So that can make it really hard too.
Mm. Interesting. So two things came up well, and you and I will work together, and sometimes you have an easier time with the deaf person than I do. Like, and I think this is your more years of experience, and then sometimes it's also just like it could be that one of us jives better with the deaf person than the other person. It could be our mood or what have you, but I've done okay with certain deaf people that you haven't really jived with
Yeah.
too.
Yep.
And so
That's true.
I think
That's
there
true.
is like in astrology, we'd say that's the composite chart. Like sometimes you don't really alchemically get along with someone. Like we get along with all our clients. It's not like you and I ever have problems with clients.
Yeah.
It's just
It's
sometimes
like
one interpreter is
personality.
a better match than another interpreter and you
Right.
find that is true?
Absolutely true. Yeah, yeah. That's why it's so brilliant to work in teams whenever we can, to be able to work in teams, because someone's always going to have a strength that you don't have. And if those two things complement each other, it's a beautiful thing. And then if you could put egos out of the way and support each other and like play to your strengths, like I've done jobs before where I interpreted for Deafway in 2001, I think, in DC, and that was like one of the hardest venues I've ever done. 10,000 deaf
That's
people
a
from
big deaf conference for
all
anyone
over the
who doesn't know.
globe, from all over the globe. So you had all kinds of relay interpreting going on, where you've got a deaf man from France signing, and another deaf person is in the audience watching them and translating their text into ASL for a hearing interpreter, who's then speaking it out for the English speaking audience, while other spoken language interpreters are speaking it in French and Italian and whatever. I mean, it's like United Nations,
Yeah.
right, level.
So, do you ever get a deaf person who's discombobulated in their language? And is it your job to make sense of that message, or what is your job there?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Unfortunately, we go into these things cold. We get, especially in the virtual world, we get very little prep. So we don't know these people. We have no context for their life experience unless they tell us. We don't know that they were born in Turkey and their first language is Turkish Sign Language, right? And that they're just now learning ASL. We don't know that. So we get something that's non-standard, and it's sort of like, whoa, what am I missing? That doesn't look like ASL. And then you're like, repeat, please, like again, like finger spell what, and they're like, and then they might tell you at that point, oh, sorry, born in Turkey. You know what I mean? And then you're like, oh, okay. So this person probably needs an intermediary interpreter who can break down the text more in a kind of international sign language style, because that's a lot to put on one interpreter, right? To just go from standard ASL to standard English, from standard English to standard ASL is hard enough.
Mhm.
But to try to break it from standard ASL, non-standard ASL, and then, you know what I mean? And then back to English is really tough for a single person to do. And deaf people do it, eloquently. So if I don't know that, it makes it hard. So sometimes I will say to the hearing person, like I might struggle for a while and be like, I have to let them know what's going on, right? So like, I'm having a little trouble with the translation. I'm not sure if they're understanding me. I'm struggling to understand them. Thus, and I'll say the sign language I'm getting is non-standard ASL. It looks like non-standard ASL. And then it's up to them to ask the deaf person, like, what's going on? What do you need? Is there some further service needed? That sort of thing, So there's only so much I can do, like outside of the translation, right?
So I want to build on what you're saying. So what I've done in written translation when this happens, like there'll be a chapter or a paragraph that's really hard to understand. And sometimes it's that I always am like, was there coffee spilled on the papyrus? Because like sometimes we're trying, and we have three translations of Valens now to compare. And the reason it's nice to have three is because sometimes we hit a point where all three translators struggled. And we're like, oh, the language in Greek was not clear there, right?
Yeah.
And so this is where I learned to put a footnote in the translation and say like, hi, this is Andrea Gehrz. I want you to know that I was struggling with this paragraph. I couldn't quite figure it out. This is what made it confusing, and just leave it up to the scholar who's reading the book to try to compare it to other translations or figure it out. So I had to learn to do that in a footnote, basically.
Right. Right. Yeah, it is. It's sort of a footnote. It feels awkward because we used to call it stepping out of role. But in my mind, it's not stepping out of role because I'm working for two people and everybody needs to kind of understand what's going on. And if I'm just leaving the doctor hanging while I'm like, again, sorry, do you mean this? Do you mean that? Oh, and then I'm voicing, oh, born turkey, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? And then I could say to the hearing person, we're kind of struggling to find common ground here. They appear to be using a non-standard form of ASL.
And then the hearing person gets to
No,
decide how they're going to handle it. And when I make that footnote, then the reader gets to decide how they're going to handle it. They might
right,
ignore it and just go to the next chapter and be like, whatever, I don't care. If they were a real scholar, they're going to go compare it to another translation, and that's going to be their approach. And so that's empowering to the reader, actually,
right,
not disempowering, you know?
right, right.
So sometimes, I have another point for us, but I want to stay on the discombobulated thing. So, have you ever met like a person on the street?
Mm.
I'm not who's discombobulated, a hearing person. You know who they're on the street and they keep talking to themselves and they're like, "Oh, pink car, my mom is coming, pink car, pink
So they're
car."
disassociated in some way.
Yeah.
They could be on drugs. They could have a mental health issue. And yes, and I give a footnote there too. Like I try to work with them, and when I'm realizing something is not right, like this is a mental health issue, right? And then I will say to the hearing person, I'm not really able to give a clear translation here. And again, I might use the term non-standard. I'm getting information that's kind of all over the place, or what. So this could be, I don't know where this is coming from. This could be a language issue. It could be a mental health issue. I can't weigh in on that, but I'm just letting them know so that it opens their mind to, oh, maybe I need to have this person evaluated
Mhm.
before we proceed with, social service determination or whatever.
And it would actually be an interpreting error there to make clarity out of discombobulation. Like a lot of young interpreters think they need to make clarity. Like they're like, if I ask them again and again, and I'm going to get something clear, and there's something wrong with me, and I'm like, no. When I interpret the discombobulated sign language in English, I'll be like, green car, going down the street. My mom is coming up, green car. Like, and if I interpret it faithfully, then I realize I'm in a psych ward, and that they're expecting
Right.
to hear discombobulated language. And if I was interpreting it clearly, I would be making up, and that would be an intrusion. I would be actually, because of my own need to look good, or, make a clear translation out of nonsense, like I would be, that's an error in translation.
It is an error. And I love that you brought this up, because there's not always one way to handle things. There's often multiple ways to handle things, and some are better than others. And some you look back on and say, wish I would have handled it that way. Because all you have in the moment is your best judgment, based on your experience, based on, whatever. But if you have to be aware of your own bias, and you have to translate either through the bias, around the bias, or you have to excuse yourself because you can't do one of those two things, right? Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So hearing what you said, depending on the context of the situation, that might be a much better choice than the choice that I opted for, to just say what you're seeing, to just say what you're seeing and go what we call go lexical, right? Because typically what we're doing is we're interpreting conceptually, because ASL has its own, Greek has its own grammar and syntax, right? And word order. So you can't do a word for word translation. If you tried to do an ASL word for word, it would sound like that. Green car, have me, other guy, not,
Mhm. Yeah.
But in reality, this guy is actually disassociated in ASL. And
Right.
so you're doing your best to convey that in the English.
Yeah.
So
Okay. We're moving mountains here. Okay, so another thing that came up when you were talking was that we're working from a live text, not a frozen text, but we actually do frozen text and translating too. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the Lord's Prayer
or the Pledge of Allegiance.
or the Pledge of Allegiance. So interpreters have to interpret the Lord's Prayer, or like in AA, the 12 steps is a frozen text, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's like, okay, let's talk about how we approach a frozen text, because this is a lot like translating a book into another, because it's a frozen text, basically.
Right. Right.
So how many
Well,
interpretations of the Star Spangled Banner are there?
oh my gosh, I'm sure there are as many interpretations of the Star Spangled Banner as there are. It's like how many covers of this one song? It's the same kind of thing, right?
Okay.
I mean, that's really a song. A cover of a song is an interpretation of the original. It may be very close to the original on purpose, or it may be completely divergent on purpose, right?
Okay.
So I would say the same is true for frozen text. Frozen text really needs to be handled ahead of time. So, it's like, I'll never forget interpreting, I won't say the name of the state. And I won't say that either. Interpreting a conference, a state conference. And the person called me, and there were going to be several interpreters working at this conference. And they asked me, there's all these different topics. Is there anything that you don't want to interpret? Is there anything you prefer not to interpret? And I said, without even thinking, I said, religion. And only because I wouldn't be a good match for it. I just don't have the language for it. And I kind of chuckled about it, thinking, it's a conference about X, which has nothing to do with religion, right? So, and I brought it up as kind of a joke, but it was true, right? And then I get there to do the conference, and let's just say it's a southern state, and it's a luncheon, and out comes the preacher to do the blah, 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 the prayer or whatever. And oh, by the way, one of their members passed away in the last week. So let's have a moment of silence. And then bada, 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 religion, religion, religion. And I remember thinking there, if you say you won't, it's going to show up in your space, right? It's like, it always happens, but the other happens too, where we go to do an interpreting assignment and something comes up and we're like, I just learned about that. Does this happen to you? You're like, I just learned about this last week. Now I have like visual on this. I have context that I didn't have a week ago. Wow. Is that synchronicity or what? And it works both directions. Anyway, so yeah, frozen text should be handled ahead of time. So if you know that you're going to be doing Star Spangled Banner, if you know you're going to be doing Lord's Prayer, take the time to analyze that material so that you can present it in its best form. Otherwise, if they spring it on you, frozen text is very difficult to translate.
So we could actually say that, like, here's like Regina Schulz on the Star Spangled Banner. Here's Andrea Gehrz on the Star Spangled Banner. Here's so and so on, like Gehrz on the banner, Schultz on the banner. Like you,
To the house.
yeah, like so. There's this conversation in astrology that there should be one definitive text of valence, right? And it's like, okay, I would say that that's actually causing a fight, because it's like, that would be like saying we need one definitive translation of the Star Spangled Banner. It's like,
Well,
how are you ever going to get people to agree, and who is the one who decides? Like, I'm an astrologer and I translated Valens, whereas Riley's edition, he's a historian, but he's not an astrologer, so he can't get all these visuals of charts and stuff, like, so I can get a lot of that context visual that Riley doesn't get, but I think they're both valid because I can't get some of the historical stuff he can get. So it's like, I don't know.
right.
What do you think of that?
See, you should work as teams. You should work as
Yes.
teams wherever possible. What I started to say is, could we please have a definitive translation of the Bible then? That's
Right.
my rebuttal to that. We'll have a definitive translation of Valence when we have a definitive translation of the Bible.
Good one. I'm going to use that one. No.
Wait a minute, whose Bible? Jehovah's Witness Bible? The Mormon Bible? The New Testament? The Old Testament? The Quran? The Torah? What Bible?
Interesting.
Which text?
Interesting. So I think it's a better way to look at it is like Garrett's on Valens, Riley on Valens, Schmidt on Valens. Bam, bam, bam. They're all awesome. Like, they're all equally valid and valuable in the scholarship, because, and you can even examine the lens of the translator you're reading. You could be like, Garrett is a working astrologer who's also been a sign language interpreter for 30 years. She blah, blah, blah. And she was Thrasilus in a past life who was a Greek grammarian living in Rome. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm not kidding. No, I think
Yeah.
I was Thrasilus, but that's controversial too. But like,
Yeah.
anyway,
Everything's controversial.
anything that's anything is controversial.
That has any kind of value, right?
But like, if I'm going to read the Riley translation, I should know about Riley, because I should know about who, like you were saying, the interpreter's not invisible in the room. Like, the translator is in the room. So it's like, if we're going to learn about Valens, we should learn also about Riley and who is translating that.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Because it's context. That's important context. Because I was going to say, like, I'm trying to think of a song that's been covered like over and over and over again. I don't know. The song Hallelujah. Oh my God, it's the same thing I just thought of. Of all the songs in the world, I said hallelujah, you said hallelujah. Whoa.
Like, we're best friends or something.
Mind blown. Yeah, so it's like, do you really want one definitive version of hallelujah? Like, I like many of them for many different reasons, you know?
Yeah, I think it's a fun rabbit hole to go down, to study the same song with like 10 different bands covering it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you this next question.
Uh-oh.
Am I your best friend? Am I one of your best friends?
You're my best work wife, but you're one of my best friends. Yes, you are. You
Okay,
are.
good.
You are.
That's right. I'm your work wife.
You are my work wife. You are the definitive work wife. You're the only one. There's no other work wife.
Oh, it's so funny. It's so funny to make people choose. Like, that's what's like, the older me is like, why were we trying to make people choose a translation of Valens? Like, that was the problem. Like, don't make people choose a best friend. Like,
Right. Well, because we're so what we were just saying earlier before we were off recording, we were talking about
gender. We were talking about gender.
right or wrong, black or white. What's the word?
Binary thinking.
Binary thinking. Thank you. Whew, I couldn't think of it in English. I could think of it in like binary. I could think of it in ASL, but I couldn't think of it in English. Yeah, exactly. It's binary thinking. We've been conditioned.
Interesting. So,
right or it's wrong, or it's good or it's bad.
So this brings me to our next question, which is, do sign language interpreters compete with each other, and why or why not?
I think we do. I hope we do with the best of intentions. I think when we're exercising our better angels, we compete around the concepts that help us do a better job of translation. It's healthy competition, you know? Well, what about this? Well, what about that? Just like we did with what do you do if somebody's disassociated, you know? How do you handle that situation? Well, the truth is it depends. The truth is it depends, because that's probably the watchword for all translations. It depends, right? In the moment, lots of factors weighing in, but I have a perspective. Joe Blow has a perspective. Jill Wheeler has a perspective. Everybody has a perspective. I couldn't think of anything. Joe Blow, Jill, I don't know what. Anyway, whatever. I'm going different
You can't
direction.
say Jill Blow. That's
Jill Blow, I know, I know. I had 40 other thoughts that, phew,
no, but I like that. I like that competition is healthy in scholarship because it makes better practitioners. That's the
yes.
only reason to compete. And I think the young interpreters I see who are really good after several years are kind of competitive with the good interpreters they see. They're like, oh, I just wish I could be like so and so. Or, I think one of mine was Jean Miller. You don't know her, but like she works for Street Leverage nowadays. I don't know if you know what that is,
Yeah,
but
I know. Leverage. Mhm.
yeah. So like I think we can have idols in interpreting or people we look up to. But I've never had an interpreter at a job compete with me. Like once you get to a certain level, like where we're like professional and like when you and I are working together and I'm having a hard time with the deaf person or the context or something like that, we're not competing. You're not like Andy's not as good as I am. Like I mean maybe in the moment you're like Andy's not on her game today or like I don't know, but I don't really get the sense that you and I are competing against
Well,
each other.
it's more like, and I do this with other interpreters. It's more like, oh, that was a good choice. Wasn't the first one that came to my mind, but I like that. And then it could be the flip side where I'm like, not the choice I would have made, but it works, you
Interesting.
know?
So I like that way of looking at these translations. Is like if with Riley handled the ancient flavors a lot differently than I did, a more terse. Um, I was a more expanded version, but I like that to say like that's not the choice I would have made, but I see where he made that choice. Like they're both equally valid choices, and they're just style. It's
Right.
style.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I don't ever feel competitive with you about our interpreting because I feel like this brings us to our next question, which is how do you know your interpretation was effective or not?
Hmm. That is the $30 million question. How do you know your interpretation was successful? I think if the clients leave happy, that's a good indication. You
What if
know,
it
like,
was a death call? Like then your interpretation wouldn't be
yeah,
successful.
the good point, because they won't be, but they've still, even with a death call, they could leave happy with the interpretation,
Okay.
because they could turn to you and say, thank you so much,
Yeah.
instead of just like, you're gone,
Well, okay, here's an example. People probably don't know what we're talking about. Okay, like when I used to work for the phone as a phone operator interpreter, sometimes you'd call and you're like you're interpreting for the deaf person and you're like, hey, this is so and so, and you're a real, and like your job is to basically yell at someone because that's what the text is. It's a yelling message.
Right. And then they imagine that it's you.
Exactly. And so, like, I remember being like yelling, I'd be like, and no, girl, you did. And I'd be like, this message has been left by interpreter 8229. Thank you. Like,
Just to make it clear, right?
yeah,
Like,
that wasn't me, that was the text.
not me, right? Yeah, that was the text.
But
Yes.
we have the ethic that we have to render the message faithfully. So even if it makes us uncomfortable, we have to render the message.
Right, right. And the other tenet, really important tenet, is to take jobs with discretion. So, when that was drilled into me in interpreting school. So when I got out of school, I worked full time as a classroom aide at the School for the Deaf for 3 years while I took assignments with discretion. Trying to kind of like ride that edge of like, this is going to be a challenge, but it's not like I'm not in the deep end of the pool sucking air, right? Like, so I'm going to push myself. I feel like I'm ready. I'm going to do this. And if it's epic fail, well, then I learn and I can dial it back, right? But I think I see a lot of, and I have over the years seen interpreter training programs kind of pump out interpreters, you know, and the interpreters expect that as soon as they finish IPP, interpreter preparation program, that they should be out there interpreting. It's like, don't quit your day job, you know, keep cutting hair, keep dog sitting, take jobs with discretion, you know,
Yeah.
have another income.
So one of the ways we make sure we're gonna do an effective translation is to make sure that we are literally equipped to do the job linguistically, experientially, or whatever. And I think early in my translation years with Greek, I wasn't necessarily that equipped to do the job because I was just learning Greek. But that's why the first book I did was the introduction to the Tetrabiblos. I didn't do violins right away. I practiced on other texts. I got feedback from those texts. I read the Bible in Greek. I did all these things to prepare. It was like I was training. It was like Rocky Balboa, like training, you know, to do valens. And like I had to, all I could do was make sure that I was ready to do the job. And then I had to go and learn teleology. Like there's a lot of stuff I had to do in order to really keep on with the text. And so that was me kind of adhering to that tenet of like, am I equipped to do this job? But I think one way we can tell if the interpretation was successful was, is there an equivalent response that there should be? Like for example, let's say someone's ordering a pizza and we interpret like, I'd like to order a pizza. If the pizza arrives at their house, we interpret it effectively.
Right? If we're there at the time it arrives, that's right. That's right. No, but that's a good point. Like sometimes it's really clear. Like, whoop, something got missed, something got misconstrued. A lot of times people will give you stuff, you know, answers to questions like, which pharmacy do you want to use? And then, you know, they give you some random street, but they're half signing it and half spelling it. And you're like, hi, what at the top? What? It doesn't seem to fit what the question was. So you're like tempted to, should I repeat the question again? Or just ask the person to like finger spell that again or whatever. So yeah,
Yeah,
I think
that's a good point. When you're doing a questionnaire, you can tell. Like, there's sometimes when we have been working together and I didn't get the question out correctly, and I was like, ugh. But some questions are really hard. You know, it's like not because we're bad interpreters. It's like sometimes if it's a frozen text, you got to study that line for months and months and ask a few people, what am I going to do with this? Like, it's not always, not every sentence is created equal, honestly. Like, so I think sometimes it's obvious, like that the person answers the question with a non sequitur. That
right.
means that we didn't do an effective interpretation.
Or maybe
It could be
mostly.
that they're a non sequitur person.
Yeah, you mean the utterance was a non sequitur.
Well, it could be some people just like you'll be in the doctor hearing people do this. They'll go to the doctor and they're like, "So how do you drink or smoke?" And the person's like, "Well, 15 years ago, so I was at this party 15 years ago." Sometimes hearing people just make non sequiturs even though they understood the question. So we don't even know if the deaf person understood the question and is making a non sequitur on purpose, or if they're making a non sequitur because we didn't interpret the message faithfully, or you know.
The worst is when someone asks a question and the deaf person answers and you say what you saw and then it's just dead silence. And you're like, because we can't see the hearing person, they're off camera, right? So we're like, did that land? Or was it, you know, because sometimes hearing people will be like a little bit afraid to ask the deaf person for, you know, if they're not familiar with deaf people, sometimes they're a little bit awkward about how to interact and they may or may not ask for clarification. You know what I mean? But maybe they're just typing into their computer off screen that I can't hear the clickety clack about. I don't know.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things happen all the time.
And I think with the Vedic Valence translation, we are now, I mean, did I interpret it effectively? Did I translate it effectively? Like, how would I know that, Regina?
Yeah, let me think about your question again. How do we know that the translation is successful? Is it always dependent on feedback from, are we always dependent? Here's my rebuttal question. Are we always dependent on feedback from the consumers to know whether the translation has been successful? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think there are times that we're uncertain about the translation. And then we're really dependent on the feedback from the participants in order to know whether we hit the mark or not. But then there are other times that we're totally secure. We
Yeah.
just know we nailed it.
I know
Right.
I nailed it. If I was being honest, I know I nailed it because I didn't write anything down until I knew what he was saying. And sometimes I had to go do research, and sometimes I had to ask people, and sometimes I did a bunch of stuff, and then I was like, I know what he means right here, and I'm gonna write it down. You know, so I actually that's really good because I think I do feel secure.
I mean, I think we cannot discount our intuition. I think that's part of the translation or interpreting process. It is, how else would we be able to do what we do in real time, sometimes with frozen text, and be successful at it? How would that be possible with only our five senses? It's not possible.
Mm,
There's something otherworldly going on. There's something sixth sense, call it intuition, call it a gut feeling. There's something that we're connected to if we have our filters, our biases out of the way. I think we get in a zone. I really do. I think anybody who's been in the zone knows what it feels like, and you're checking only with yourself. You're not checking with some external validation because you know you're nailing it
mhm,
in the moment. But the moment you start to think, I'm nailing it, at least in real time, the moment you start to think I'm nailing it, you just took some of the attention particles that were out here, these valuable attention particles that were out here on the subject, and you put them back on you.
mhm.
And now
Well,
you
to be
lost
honest, Regina,
connection.
there are times when you and I have worked together where I wasn't nailing it, and I know that. Like I even said that to you in the chat. I was like, I'm not doing so good with this one. And usually that's when we have a language consumer who uses a different sign language, and I'm not doing enough gesture. Or like, but I've admitted to you, like I'm not nailing this, and I know that. Like I'm the kind of interpreter who, when I'm not nailing, I know that, and I'm humble enough to definitely because for me it's more about the work. It's not about ego. It's about like, okay, like is this a successful translation or not? But I will say that my definition of whether or not I got a book translated well or not is if the reader has the same equivalent. I like experience equivalency model.
Yes,
If
right.
the reader has the same experience of reading Valens that I did in Greek, but they're reading it in English. And that's where all my footnotes come in, where I'm like, this is what I saw here, this is what I noticed here, like here's a finger spell. Like I actually include a lot of Greek words in phonetical, and then I give the all the meanings in the footnotes. I do that like that would be like finger spelling the word. Like so I actually, so I think I've created a text that has an experience equivalence to reading it in Greek.
We could do an entire show on what is equivalence.
Okay.
That's a deep topic, because as you're saying that, even though I know exactly what you mean, and part of me agrees with you, I will disagree with the idea that everyone has an equivalent experience. I think none of us have an equivalent experience. I think an experience is a personal thing.
Well, and I agree with you because everyone has a different chart and they see the world through different eyes. And so that's why art is a Rorschach. Like we all will look at Valens and each have our own experience also.
Right, right. But so maybe it's not about equivalence, although we banter that around a lot. And I think we do for a reason. Equivalence is something we should strive for, right? In our interpretation, like is this the way he just said it? I should be at some point in my translation, before my utterance, I should be asking myself, how do hearing people talk about this? If I'm working from ASL to English text, I should be thinking about what I'm about to say from the hearing person's perspective. I first have to look at it from the deaf person's perspective. What is he saying? Given what I know, along with the context, we're in a mental health institution. He fingerspelled something. Oh, and even though he's fingerspelled it incorrectly, I knew what he meant. And in the context, it makes sense. And so, all right. And I also am applying what I know about how my limited knowledge, right, of how deaf people talk about certain things, right? That's part of my picture. Now I have to take all that information in and do the translation in my mind, but I have to switch my perspective to the hearing person's perspective and talk about it in a way that makes sense to them.
Well, okay, so just building on what you're saying. So what I would do is and this is, I'm just answering my own question of like, how do we know it's successful? Okay, so like here in the introduction to the Tetrabiblos, which is another book I translated, right? So he has little sections. Like, okay, I just opened up to the section on masculine and feminine signs. Okay, so I can control the kind of experience equivalence of this little paragraph, and I can be like, does the person reading in English grok the same thing that I grokked in the Greek for that little section? You know, it's like, okay, there are some signs that are masculine, some that are feminine. You know, like I'm like, okay, if you read that in English, you got it. You got, you know, but then there's some things where it's just not, the text pops in and out of ease of as far as like getting equivalency across. Like some things are really easily, like if 1 + 1 = 2 is really easy to translate because
It's
it's like, there's
straightforward.
like one, there's like linear and poetic text. So like a linear text has one translation, and then poetic text could be a million things. Like the Bible is a poem or a poetic text, basically, or the Star Spangled Banner is a poetic text. Like it's hard to explain, but there are more linear moments in text and more poetic moments,
For
and
sure.
so that's where there's a lot of translators might come out with the same translation on a linear portion, and then in a more poetic portion we might see 14 different options.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah, I agree. So that's why I say like equivalence, linguistic equivalence, but the experience is not necessarily, nor should it be equivalent, especially if you're talking about nonlinear, more poetic, more artistic type of prose or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not going to judge my translation solely on, are these two having the same experience? At the same time, I can say, he's laughing, she's laughing, it's all good. Right? They both got the joke.
The intent of the text is really important. For example, when I do music concerts, you know, and I work with these interpreters, and they're like, some of them are like really nervous, and they're like, well, this was really political. I did a Chris Brown concert, which is an African American singer, and so I'm a white Caucasian person, and so that's a weirdness because the text is culturally POC, and I'm like white, which is a weird thing. So we found an African American team for me. Well, she was a Christian, really like it's hard to explain, but my interpretation spiritually was a lot closer to Chris Brown because I'm just like more like open, and she's like a Christian and he's swearing and talking about grinding, and it was like really weird because what is the intent of the text? The intent of this musical performance is to entertain, number one. So if you're entertaining the crowd, you're actually getting the text across. Where my teammate wasn't really entertaining the crowd. She was like going on the sentential level of, right, you know, he like she's like signing like this, you know, and I'm like signing like this, you know, like I'm getting the text out and I'm dancing, and like I actually got video at that concert. Like someone was like, check you out. And I was like, oh yeah. Like, you know, and he was like an African American guy videoing me. And I was like, I must have hit the right note, you know? But the point is like the intent of the text there is to entertain, number one. Is the but someone's missing the point if they go on the sentential level and they're like micro analyzing each word, and that's what they're practicing. I'm like, you got to practice like being a musician. Like, you see what I'm saying is like,
Yeah, no. It's like
but the intent of a doctor's appointment is totally different. It's like to get on the right med and to make, you know, so if I was being entertaining in my translation there, that I would be hitting a wrong note, you know?
right. Right. True. Yep. Good point.
Yeah, so the intent of the
Yeah,
text,
so that would fall under taking jobs with discretion.
totally.
That was the wrong job for her.
Yeah, totally. But but it was the right job for her because of her cultural heritage. That's where it was like a really cool pair, and it was a little controversial because like I was right spiritually because I'm a musician, and she was right culturally. It was like we both were right for different reasons, and there were strengths of both translations, you know.
Interesting.
So, but what's the intent of Vedia's Phalans?
I don't know. What is the intent?
God, we can make a whole video with a bunch of astrologers. Like, what is the intent of the Vedic Founds anthology? Well, I will say this: he was a working astrologer. He actually practiced and he did chart readings, and I think he ran a whole school. So maybe the intent of the text was that he was they were the textbooks for his school.
Oh, yeah,
Whereas,
educate, right? To
yeah,
educate.
whereas the introduction to the Tetrabiblos and the Tetrabiblos, I think the intent of these are more, God, now I'm gonna have to think on this. Like, what is the intent of each of these? I don't know. But I do
Well,
think Valens was entertaining. He was trying to be kind of dark and occult and like epic.
okay. Okay.
Like, I guess, like, what's the intent of the Bible?
Like Aleister Crowley or something, right?
Yeah, he's like the ancient Aleister Crowley.
Yeah. Of astrology.
I guess, yeah, what was the intent of Valens? God, that would be a really good video to ask like 10 scholars. Like, what do you think the intent of Valens was? Okay.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see what you get back, how similar or dissimilar they are.
Okay, am I tiring you out yet?
No, what
Okay.
time? I've got a few more minutes.
Okay. What do you do if you hit a concept about which there is no sign?
Right. So expansion. Uh, Sometimes I will ask for the hearing person to give examples. So if I try to convey something and that a person like has no context for it, that it does or it doesn't make sense to them in some way.
So wait,
Sometimes
wait. So let's give an example of a word there would be no sign for.
okay, yeah, I just had something like this not too long ago. Let me try to remember what the context of it was. Oh yes, it was a health insurance. It was a benefits enrollment for somebody's company, right? And so they were trying to talk to them about the whole idea of deductibles versus a cap, a max that the insurance will pay, right? So there's a deductible, which is not really signed deductible, right? It's like the
Which that means to deduct.
right to deduct, which it doesn't mean
Which
that,
is a
right?
different than yeah, right. It doesn't
Right,
mean deduct. That would
right,
be an error if you said deductible.
right, right. So, and I usually will pair that and spell it because the person's probably going to see it in print that it's a deductible, right? So, but usually I lay it out as like, okay, so suppose you go to the dentist and everything you need is $3,000. You pay the first $50, then that leaves $2,950. Now your insurance is going to pay up to 2,000. And what's left, that's yours. You have to pay that.
So in that case, you used an example of a deductible. So that's expansion, where sometimes
Right.
we hit a word in the text where we're like, I need to go ahead and explain all this stuff in order to get that across to you. Um, so yeah, one of the critiques of my Valence translation is that I'm too wordy. And I was doing expansion, like we would hit a Greek word for which there was no English equivalent at all. Like apotelesmatics, for example, which means it's the ancient word for astrology, but it means all things connected to a telos expressing itself full on, which then I had to write an article on teleology, which is called An Introduction to Teleology for the Modern Astrologer, and teach them what teleology is, because teleology is all where there's text. So like sometimes I'll actually make an introduction section of the book on a teleology so that I can then render the word apotelesmatics later. Like it takes so much expansion sometimes to make sure a word is rendered that it's not even funny actually.
Yeah, right. So in that case, I actually gave a leaner interpretation at first because I don't know what the person understands, right? So I just tell them $50 deductible, but insurance pay max 2,000, and they didn't get it. So they thought they got it and they were like, you mean blah, blah, blah. And they were like, no, actually. And they're like, well, I don't want to sign up for that because then I have to pay everything. You know, I have to pay everything except what's the point of having the insurance, right?
Mhm.
And the hearing person was like, no, wait, you need to understand some more. You need to understand that it's broken down into categories. So for basic services, like say you need a filling, right?
Yeah.
But he didn't say that, actually. I knew that. He said, and I have a background in dentistry too. So he said, your basic services are paid at 85%. So you're going to be paying 15%. They're going to be paying 85. So it's not like they're like chunk, chunk, chunk. They're like piece, 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 piece. And that adds up to 2,000.
Mhm.
Beyond that, they pay nothing.
Mm.
Right? So it's like, it's subtle and it's deep, it's complex, right? These whole ideas of categories. So finally, at this point, I said to the guy, could you please give an example of a bill and how it might spread across several categories? That way it's on him and I could do the actual translation.
So this is where communication is said to be a loop. Like this is why it's so hard to do air Kadar, which is interpreting for the whole
Right.
crowd when you don't have a receiver, and we'll get to that later. But okay, because communication is a loop, you got to throw out a word. We're actually taking a concept and making some words and sending some words over, hoping that they get the same concept in their mind, right? But you might have to be like, so deductible. And what I'm saying is, do you know the
Right.
word
Right.
deductible? And if we get a nod from the deaf person, yes, I know what it is. Okay, your deductible is X, Y, and Z. If they say like, I don't know, deductible, you're like, hold on 1 second. Okay, a deductible is, and then you go and explain it. Okay. So in a frozen text, we have to decide what we're going to do with each of these situations. So here I found in this book, I say, here's a sentence. It says, the double-bodied signs follow the fixed signs, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces. These constellations sit between the fixed and tropical signs. They are known for their specific quality of telos. You understand what that means?
No.
Okay, so look, I just did that thing where I was like, do you understand telos? You're like, no. And so then I put a footnote that says, for more information on telos, refer to an introduction to teleology for the modern astrologer by Andrea Gehrz at astro.com.
Right. So footnotes are an awesome answer, but in order to even conceive of the footnote, you had to predict that this could be that not everybody's going to understand what this means.
Right.
What did you use to decide that? I mean, what cued you to the idea that certain people or most people would not understand what telos was?
Oh, just because it's not a modern colloquial word. Teleology is a concept that all ancients knew, but modern people don't know, right? So it's just a commonly unknown thing. Let's check out another example. Is it possible to walk away from the fates of Ananke?
Of
Okay,
a
Ananke. It's a Greek word. Now I could have just said fate. Is it possible to walk away from fate? Okay, but Ananke is a certain kind of fate. There were several kinds of fate in Greek. There was Moira and Ananke. So I chose to put the Greek word Ananke in and then made a footnote with, look at this. It's the actual dictionary definition of all the things Ananke means.
Is there any relation to the Anunnaki?
And no, the Anunnaki. No, like I know what
Okay,
you're talking about.
totally
But
different.
but see, this is me
That
doing
would be,
expansion basically and giving them all the
yeah,
possibilities of what it means instead of just choosing one thing called fate.
right. Yeah. Yeah. There are like leaner and meteor translations, right?
Yeah. Have you ever heard of hermeneutic tension?
No.
Okay, this is a new one. My friend Marlene and I are going to make a video on hermeneutic tension because apparently it's the tension between those decisions of like if the translator picks one meaning or if they flesh it out. That's called hermeneutic tension.
Ooh, I like that. I'm
Yeah.
gonna have to have you text me that because I don't have a pen on me right now, but hermeneutic. Hermeneutic.
Okay, you ready? Okay, we're getting somewhere. How would you translate these concepts? I'm going to give you 5 things and we're going to watch you translate them. Okay, you ready?
Oh no, pressure.
Abstractionism.
Okay, the first thing I'm gonna say to you is I don't interpret at the lexical level unless there's a specific reason to do so. So if you ask me how to translate something, I'm gonna ask you to put it in a sentence.
So what's it mean to translate at the lexical level?
So translating at the lexical level is like saying, what's the ASL sign for walking? Well, it depends, right? Like that's a lexicon, that one lexical item, that word, right? Is walking. So walking, it depends because it's a visual language. So are we walking with a whole body? Are we staggering? Are we using, is it important that we depict the legs in the
So
walking?
lexical means the word level. You're saying I don't
Word
translate at
level.
the word level. So you wouldn't actually translate abstractionism, just you don't know what it means there. Okay, let me put in a sentence. Abstract.
No, but so context is everything. Okay, so I will just say, let's say I'm in an art class and the teacher says, today we're going to talk about abstractionism. In that case, I would say today's topic is, and I would fingerspell abstractionism.
Let's
It's
see
not
you think
important. It's not important that they know the meaning of it
yet.
because it hasn't been given yet. Right?
Okay.
He's saying today's topic is this, meaning he's, foreshadowing that they're going to, deconstruct that, or they're going to learn about it today.
Okay. Can
So
we
it's not
see fingerspell abstractionism just for fun?
abstractionism. I hope I spell it right.
Okay. Well, that's pretty good. Do you want me to spell it with my nails on?
Yeah, just because I want to see the green flying.
Okay. It wasn't that clear. It wasn't that clear. Okay.
It was clear. It's
Okay.
clear.
Okay. So, okay, finger spelling. Now, this is something that the translators that worked on balance didn't know about. And this is why I would make an argument that my translation is a little bit, it's too mean to use the word better. But I would say that including finger spelling into the text, with vowels, it happens all the time where I'll come across a word that doesn't exist and you cannot actually just make a transliteration of it. But the other translators would. They would try to make a transliteration of, um, I don't know, there's just countless examples where I basically finger spelled the word I phonetically rendered it in the Greek and then gave the footnote and let them kind of expand on it. Like, I think that's a strength of the Moira Press translation, is what I'm trying to say.
I would say that your translation then, based on what you just said, is richer, not better. It's richer. Like we said, there are leaner and richer translations. There might be those translators that believe that a leaner translation is a purer translation because it has less of the translator in the text. But then you could make an argument for the same
Okay.
in a richer, I think, in a richer translation also.
Thanks for giving me that language because I'm not trying to start any debates or fights, actually. I'm just trying to say there's something about my translations that's different. It's different. It's different, baby. Like, it's
Well,
richer.
you put your heart and soul in really trying to be equivalent. And in order to be equivalent, you felt it was important to make these additional footnotes and clarifications and synonyms and, points for further investigation and things like that. That's what, for you, that's what it felt like to be really true to the text.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks, sir. I'm not trying to be controversial. I just am sick of my translation being critiqued when it just, I think it's a really rich translation. That's all I'm gonna say.
Well, I mean, for a long time, when we switched from the machine model to the bilingual bicultural model, there were naysayers that were saying, all of these expansion things, they're just interpreters adding to the text. And we would rebut that by saying, we're not adding to the text. You're actually deleting from the text by not including this other contextual information.
Okay, so I should just let the debates go on because sign language interpreters have been debating for years to try to make a better translation or the best translation. I mean, that is the field scholars debate. That's what they do. I need to get used to that.
Maybe healthy, like we talked about, healthy competition. It's not really competing to see who wins. It's competing hopefully for, the digestibility, the equivalency
The
of the,
greatest good of all concerned.
Yeah, the greatest good. Exactly.
Okay, so when would your sign of abstractionism change? Let's say you had been interpreting about abstractionism for hours and hours now. Do you start stopping to finger spelling it, and does it change? What does it change to?
Ah, that's a good question. Again, context is everything. So if we're going to stay with, I'm in a classroom, let's say I'm in a college classroom. So I'm working with an adult. It may be that I can see the writing on the wall that we're going to be using that word, that concept again and again and again. First of all, the cool thing about ASL is you could set something up in space, kind of set it and forget it. You can refer back to it, right? So let's say he's comparing, I don't even know quite what abstractionism is, but I know what it means to be abstract. So let's say you're comparing abstractionism with what would be the opposite of it? What would be,
Linearalism.
okay, linearalism. Ooh, that's a mouthful of marbles. Right, I see. I get where you're going. So maybe I would set up abstractionism over here where I have explained, he's already explained what it is, right? And I've got some trying to explain this for the novice, right? Role shifting and eye gaze that's in agreement with that point in space. And I've done all my do there, right? So we're clear on what that is now. And now he's like, as opposed to linearalism, marble mouth. And then I set that up over here. Then from then on in the text, all I have to do is point to those two things because we already set them up in space. Really nice. Or another way to do it is to, let's say we're going to cover this for weeks to come. Let's say the whole class is about that, right? We might come up with a sign together that's like it's like a one-time use for this class. You and I are going to agree that we're going to sign abstractionism as a compound sign of abstract and philosophy,
Oh, nice.
right? And then from then on, it's going to become more and more like its own sign as we go on, because that's the way language works. The first time you say linearalism, it sounds like if you have marbles in your mouth. But after you say it a few times, then it actually starts to sound like a word, right?
Yeah.
Same kind of thing with signing. So that like abstract philosophy will get shorter and shorter, the distance between, and it'll become like a loan sign, almost like what you do with figure spelling that
Yeah.
becomes more sign-like. I think that's what will happen. Compound sign.
Interesting. This happened in the Vedi's Valens translation with this translator Robert Schmidt, who was brilliant. And what he did, there was this one word that they were trying to figure out, and it was called well, they decided on sect, SECT. But if you look at the Greek, it means class. Like a sect is like a school of thought, like a sect. That's why they chose sect. But in my translations, I always say class. It's the nocturnal and diurnal sect of planets, like night and day sect. But the community discussed it and they decided they like sect. Well, in my translations, I like class, like the day class of planets and the night class of planets, because it's more palatable for any reader. They don't have to know about Hellenistic theory to know that sect is what was decided on. And I do think it means class. He's just saying it's the day class of planets and the night class of planets. I'm 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 not saying sect is wrong, but that's what they agreed. But that sect is actually an agreed upon selection between Robert Schmidt and his community. That
So it
was
only makes sense to them. It's only
exactly
makes sense to them. Just like abstract philosophy for abstractionism only makes sense to me and my client.
because you negotiated it.
We negotiated it, right?
Language is a
Outside of
negotiation,
this
actually.
class, it's a
Yes.
different deal. If you go to a lecture at some other time and location, because we've already agreed on that, I can use it again. But
Yeah.
if I'm somewhere else and the term happens to come up and it's in a meeting, corporate meeting, I have to start with finger spelling again.
Yes, because it's
Client
a
new day.
negotiation between you and the client. And I would say that Schmidt was negotiating with his readers. And that to say that the only translation of that is sect is not correct because that is the one negotiated translation. But I would like to negotiate with my readers the translation of class because I just think they're both great choices. It's just a negotiation, right?
Which
You
is
want to
context dependent. It's context dependent.
Yes, and receiver dependent. Like because you set up abstract philosophy with that one receiver, that's what it means. But when you doing it in a different context, you have a different language receiver, a different deaf client, and so you have to negotiate it again,
Right.
right? So want to see what I signed for abstractionism?
Yeah.
It's going to be different. I love yours. I love yours.
Be different.
What I used to negotiate with my students was like abstractionism.
Interesting. Explain.
So it's abstract
Yes.
point everything around the point. What it literally
Oh,
means in English is everything connected to something being abstract. And the reason I know that is it comes from the Greek ending idzdo. Ism comes from idzdo. And in Greek, idzdo means to turn something into something. So it's like
so
abstract
humanism.
ism. It's like everything that becomes abstract or is abstract or like so I'm like abstractionism. Is
Hmm.
that weird? Mine's not right or wrong, and yours isn't right
No,
or
it's not right or wrong. I'm just trying to understand it. And in the context of what we've been talking about also. So like, how would you sign humanism then?
well, I would start with like humanism with the client. Then I might say humanism, like human point, like of something connected to humanism. But that's why I always do humanism. Like it's like that's my ism ending is
Yeah,
like
but
kind of
what
like
does it really mean? Like,
it
what
means
does
everything
humanism
connected
mean?
to something being human.
Well, that's the Greek definition of it, but what does it mean? Because when
Well,
I'm not getting a meaning from like, what is humanism?
Well,
What
and that's where scholars,
related to
one
being
scholar
human?
might define humanism in an article, and they might say like humanism is like the ego got taken out. Like ego means myself, but Freud took ego and made all this scholarship around ego, which changed the word ego culturally, so it means something. You see what I mean? It's like humanism depends on who's defining it, and because all we know from that ending is all things connected to being human.
Right. So everything about being human,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Well, let's racism. Let's talk about that one. That's actually
Everything,
become racism.
that's
Like,
not really everything related to race.
well, that's right. It is actually literally everything connected to race, but what we've turned racism into is something that's about race that like so we often sign racism, which is like race against, right?
Right.
Like but we wouldn't be like racism because that's not actually what it means colloquially. It means like race against.
So again, context is everything, right? It's
Yeah.
everything.
How do you sign racism?
Huh?
How do you sign
I,
racism?
I figure spell it.
Okay,
Right.
interesting. So you allow all the meanings of it, like you allow all the.
Yeah, I mean, because most of the time, if I'm interpreting when that comes up, it's kind of thrown out as a very colloquial term that most people are familiar with, right?
Hmm, yeah,
Sexism, racism, homophobia, I might use against. It depends. It depends on the, it
okay,
depends on the context. It depends on the group. It
okay.
depends
Let's move
on
to.
the point. Like, what is the point? Why? I have to remember the overarching goal too. Like, why are these people meeting in the first place? Like, this is the meta part of it, the part where we're talking about racism. But is this a training? Is this HR training employees on, how to be more equitable in the workplace? And
Yeah,
so they're bringing up racism as one of those points. And then how are they bringing it up? Like, is this something we're really going to explore? So again, I might fingerspell it knowing we're going to dig into it,
yeah.
I know it's
This is so
interesting.
good. I love
It's
talking to you.
the
Can you
different,
realize this is how we connect as friends is by talking.
yes, we don't do well on text.
We do great on text, but I think we have so much rich stuff to talk about and say that I really feel more expanded with you in
Yeah,
this.
true.
I think our friendship's going to grow by doing these episodes because we're going to finally get to explore life together at the level we could, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Potential.
Okay, do you want to do one more before we let you go?
Sure.
Okay. How would, and now I'm going to, okay, this, I just want to see what you're going to come up with this. How would you sign astrological transit?
I knew you were going to ask me to do this. So the very first, I knew you were going to ask me to do something astrological because I've already said I know nothing about astrology for the most part. Not nothing. I've learned a little bit from you, but I don't really know it. So the first thing I want to say, like by way of escape, just to be totally transparent, is that I would not take a job where I'm interpreting an astrology conference, anything like other than very surface mention of astrology. I would not interpret an astrology class, probably, unless it was for beginners, where I was going to learn along with the students, right? But anything where the client knew more about the subject than I did would be tricky, For,
But wait a second, you get hired for jobs all the time through agencies and you just go in there blind. I mean, come on. You like there's stuff all the time that you're
True,
dealing
but
with.
if I had the choice and someone was going to hire me to interpret astrology, I would turn it down, just like I would turn down religious services and do all the time.
Okay.
Funerals, down. Wedding, down. Any religious, no. It's a
Okay.
automatic no for me, right? Because I just don't know anything, about astrology. I have nothing to pull from, right? Most everything that I do that I go in cold, I have some life experience to draw from, some life experience. If not, oh, I actually know a lot about that subject. But I would be in a blind alley. So you want me to interpret astrological transit. So let's say I'm in a class or not a class, would pick another context just to make it doubly
An
hard.
astrology conference.
Oh God. Well, first of all, like I said, I would never say yes to that. But if I had, and then was like shaking in my boots, astrological transit. So God, now I know everybody in the room knows more about this than I do. That could play to my favor because I could fingerspell astrological transit and they would know exactly what I was talking about. And hopefully they would give me the sign for it. Because that's what happens a lot of times. If the deaf person is more knowledgeable on the subject than I am, I mean, I interpreted tech in Silicon Valley for years, right? They were constantly having to give me, if not the sign, an understanding and education about the concept so that I could interpret it for them, right? So yeah, so that's what I would do. I would fingerspell it and I would give some sort of a facial marker to let them know that I didn't have a sign for it. So hopefully they would reciprocate with one.
Okay.
And then,
And this is why I asked you because this is actually what we do first is to ask if there's already a code for that word. So like if we don't know, let's say I was translating a book like Valens and a weird word came up that didn't exist in English. Or no, it's like if it's a technical term. I don't know. I did this a lot at the beginning with other scholars. As I'd be like, "What does he mean here? What does he mean?" I did this a lot at the beginning. I was asking a lot of questions, like what, and then when I got enough, I was like, "Okay, I see what's going on here," and then I went forward. So I actually did that at the beginning of Valence. Was I got in there with the scholars and I saw what they already knew and what they didn't know, and I was like, "Okay, there's already a term for this. There's already a term for this." Like for example, there's one called Dorophoria in Greek, which they translated as spear bearing. Or there's one that is a casting of beams, like it's called actinobaleo, which they were like it's a casting of rays, and so that's like a planet casting a ray over here. Like so, I had to do some research to figure out what was going on already, and once I got that, then I was ready to go ahead with my translation. So once you have been fed enough signs at the astrology conference, can you go now?
yeah, yeah. Like, I think I like that strategy. I like the idea of like, I might even take a stab at it. I might say, if I felt comfortable with the client, I might say like astrology transit, with that like question, so that's indicating to the client that I'm open to them giving me a better sign than the one I'm using. Like I'm basically saying, is that correct?
Or do you like that?
Yeah, is that correct? Or do you like that? There you go.
Yeah, because like I always sign transit, like this is my sign for it, which is this is well, there's
Like
something
travel. right.
classifiers, and this is like a planet traveling around exactly, it's travel. It's a planet traveling. That's what a planet in transit is traveling. And I work with a deaf astrologer all the time who's just likes that enough to have accepted it. So when I sign it, they also sign it, or like we've had to negotiate signs for like aspects, like there's a deaf astrologer who's out there who like signs sextile, and I sign sextile because this is me drawing the picture of but
Right.
it's we have different signs for sextile. But I think it's just me and my deaf astrologer that I talk to, we sign those things, and so they are codes for those things that exist among us, but that's not the definitive sign for transit, right? Like, or the definitive sign for sextile.
Right. Right.
Now, when does something become a definitive sign? Do you remember computers when it was computer,
Yeah.
computer, or computer? There was three signs going around, and now the only sign we see is computer.
Yeah, I signed computer. Yeah.
I've never seen someone sign. Could you remember this sign for computer?
That was one of the original signs was computer for the tape thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but now we only see computer.
Yeah.
So what'll happen in linguistics is they'll
Computer. I see computer a lot too. Like,
really, which means
oh, I'm
laptop.
using my phone, computer busy, or computer not working.
Really,
But
that's
what they mean
laptop.
is the laptop. Yeah. But it's
Interesting.
just, yeah. They're
Okay.
just being specific about it, you know?
Well, my last question for you, thank you so much for today, and I can't wait to talk to you more. What should we call our episode today? How about translation talks with Regina Schulz and Andrea Gehrz?
I like it.
Translation talk one.
There you go.
How's that?
I like it.
Is there anything you want to talk about?
I think we covered a lot. What time is it? Yeah, it's probably a good time to end.
Do you feel lighter?
I do. I feel like I could go to sleep and take a little nap now.
I feel like we moved a little mountain there.
Chill.
Well, thank
I
you.
was actually surprised. I thought we would be more divergent on certain topics or on many topics than we were, because we often are. But on this one, I felt like we were, I mean, you had some interesting points that I hadn't thought of, some interesting like options also that were different than mine, but I didn't feel like we were like, oh no, I totally disagree with that, right? Which we do. We could do that sometimes, right?
Yeah. No, I think what's cool about us is as our friendship goes along and we realize we're both freaking total champions, then we're like, I can't wait to hear your perspective on this. No, I feel like we both care as much, equally much about our work, and we both care about whether or not we do an effective job, and we both have different approaches because we're just different people.
No time for losers, cause we are the champions of the world. There you go.
All right, Regina, well, I can't wait for the next one.
All right, me too. Number two.
All
Number
right.
two in the bin.
All right.
No, number one in the bin. Number two in the ethers.
Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording.